Welcome, everybody, to Linc International's Linc Voices, where we will discuss real issues and share knowledge and understandings of our global world. Our goal is to provide insight to our viewers, participate in conversations that elevate and increase awareness, and allow diverse voices to be heard as we link ourselves to the global villages and networks that inform our individual perspectives. I'd like to introduce our guests today. We have Dr. Deanza Spalding and Dr. Joyce Green. I am Dr. Karen Brown, and today we are here to discuss a little bit more about some things that we kind of started on last week when we talked about living in context. Today we're going to talk more about international psychology and three of the foundational principles that inform in international psychology, and those are being culturally sensitive, contextually informed, and the cultural relevance of international psychology. So we'll start with Dr. Spalding, or Deanza, if I may. We'll start with Deanza, and can you talk to us more about being culturally sensitive?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you here today, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about what the principle of cultural sensitivity means and what that looks like and why that's really important in the work that we're doing in all of our contexts and as it is a tool of international psychology. One of the things about cultural sensitivity is that it's really grounded on the understanding that people have very different experiences within the broader society and within the broader culture. And a lot of times, from kind of a Western perspective or majority-minded perspective, there is this kind of assumption that everyone shares the same kinds of experiences. And so it's really important that we have cultural sensitivity because we know that people have different experiences, particularly people of color experience discrimination, oppression, and racism in Western contexts. And in having an understanding of that, we can more broadly build relationships around all of those various parts and really provide strong foundations about how we support everyone in our communities and everyone in our organizations. And so an example of this was when I was doing my research on domestic violence and I was looking into the literature on domestic violence. One of the things that I've noticed is that the construct of domestic violence and how we understand it really derives from a Western white feminist lens. And that doesn't always speak to the experience of women who are going through domestic violence that are also dealing with immigration issues and racism and so on and so forth. And so when I was thinking about, okay, how do we understand domestic violence? How do we provide a broader framework of support for women that are dealing with domestic violence, I knew that I needed to have an understanding from the perspective of women that were going through domestic violence and were also experiencing discrimination and racism and all of these things that actually created barriers for them getting support and the assistance that they needed so that they could be safe and their children could be safe. I couldn't just use the construct that has been used for several decades and apply that to their experience. I needed to have the sensitivity of understanding it from their perspective, what that was like, so that we could have that vital information and we could continue to expand how it is we meet the needs of domestic violence survivors, especially those that are immigrating here to the United States. And what I learned from survivors, I worked with a Latina population of immigrants that were coming from Mexico, and what I learned is that when they came to the border to ask for help regarding the domestic violence that they were trying to flee from, they were met with a lot of racist responses, like you need to go back to your country, like you don't belong here, and various other things that really barricaded them from being able to receive really the services and the help and the support that they needed. So in gaining that information and having that broader understanding and grounding it in kind of the actual cultural experiences of people that are going through these intersecting parts of trying to uh, access safety, then we can go back and we can actually start to integrate that information and start to train people about how to have a more culturally sensitive and inclusive lens so that we can meet the needs of all survivors. And that is one example of what that can look like and why that's important and what kind of information we get by implementing a culturally sensitive approach to the work that we're doing. And so one of the questions that I was thinking about that I wanted to throw out there for all of us here on this call is, some people watching this might be thinking to themselves, you know, our organization operates just fine. Why would we need a culturally sensitive lens in our organization? Why do we need this international psychological tool? And what could we gain from that? And I think one of the things that came to mind for me, and then I want to hear from you, Karen, you, Joyce, about what your thoughts are, is that part of the reason why this is important in our organizations is because relationships are key. And if we want to continue to move towards our mission and towards implementing the goals, the strategic goals that we have for our organizations, we all have to be on board and we all have to be connected to what that mission is in mind. And how that happens is in the relationships that we establish with one another. And the relationship building is so important because, you know, everyone has to feel like they have a stake at hold in the organization and that their experience is representative in the organizational milieu and things. And so it can be a really important tool to have that cultural sensitivity, because then you get to understand all the different things that people are bringing to the table and their cultural experiences that they're bringing to the table. And that becomes part of the relationships that you're establishing with your team. And those tools then go back into how you're moving together as a team to accomplish your strategic goals and your mission as an organization. So those are a couple of my thoughts. I just thought I would just like throw them out there. Love to hear from you all what you think about that. I think it's really important. I think we need to have environments where we are being sensitive to all the experiences that people bring to the table.
Thanks, Deanza. I completely agree with you. And you said something really important, and that was that cultural sensitivity builds connection and it builds relationship, which is so essential in working across diverse teams. And one thing that I wanted to add is that, you know, we should be able to work together despite our differences. And there was a post that Linc International that we wrote about, that it's not despite our differences, but it's because of our differences. And so I wanted to transition into this, our second point of being contextually informed. And so the second principle of international psychology is to be contextually informed. And that relates to being culturally sensitive, because if we're going to build bridges with each other and deepen our relationships, it's important not to focus on how we're alike, but also focus on our unique differences. And that's to understand each other in context. And we use the hashtag a lot, you know, living in context. And we talked about this at our last Linc Voices, but living in context is understanding people in the context of where they came from, how they came here, the story of who they are. And I think we often miss those nuances. We like to assume that just because maybe we came from the same country or the same region and we live there, that we're generally have the same values or the same cultural beliefs. And that's not always true. I'm Asian American. I was born in Laos. You might not know that about me, but I'm Southeast Asian. but my parents are also from China, and I have some background in Indonesia, as well as some connection to Thailand and mainland China. So again, you know, you might look at me and assume, oh, she's Asian American, but you know, the diaspora of Asian Americans is very broad. And so understanding people in context, being contextually informed about where people came from, their backgrounds, their histories, their stories, it takes time and effort and a mindset of understanding to to get at some of those nuances. And so I want to say that when we work with diverse individuals in whatever team situation, or if we're going to be traveling abroad and interfacing with people, or even, and I want to challenge you, even those in your own neighborhood, those who you might assume or think that you're the same, but you know, dig a little deeper, take that time to understand each other for who they are, where they came from, their family background, but also the story, because development is influenced not just by your environment, but also by the political and social context of where you live. So, you know, the fact that I am in the East Coast, I'm sorry, in the West Coast in California, and Karen is in Florida, and Deanza is in the Pacific Northwest, we're all different and we're diverse. And so I think it's important for us to also seek to understand the context of where we live, which also includes the politics, the social environments, the historical context that influences who we are and what we believe.
This is an amazing segue to our third principle, foundational principle, which is cultural relevance. And so when we talk about being contextually informed and culturally sensitive, we have to understand the cultural relevance. So, Joyce, you said something about how we got here, and Deanza, you talked about our experiences. And so let's just take the example of Black and Brown peoples here in North America, and specifically in the United States. When we understand the relevance of the culture and how this entire these events have come to place, and why it's so important for us to understand the relevance of the culture. The United States, so we let's stop and say this up front. Slavery is not a new thing. It has been in existence all over the world for hundreds of thousands of years. It's not something that Blacks have cornered the market on, right? But and I did my research in Australia with the Aboriginals. They were not considered to be slaves, but culturally, they deal with the same issues and problems that Black and Brown people are dealing with in the United States. And it's amazing because it's not, you know, I've been to Australia once, so I don't know their traditions. I don't really understand, you know, their language. Even though they do speak English now, that's not their original language. But the culture, and the reason why we are still having issues here in the United States is because we have to look at how we got here and how the you know, the history has brought us to where we are. And you can say that about any culture, right? It's the relevance, and then we have to look at the policies and the procedures that were put into place, you know, whenever they were put into place, that still affect us now, right? And these are the things that we have to look at when we're talking about being culturally sensitive, understanding who we are, how we got here. You know, there's an old adage that says you don't know what a person has gone through until you walk a mile in their shoes, right? And so when we don't understand or we're not sensitive to those experiences and we're not contextually informed about where they come from and how they got to where they are, then the relevance does not matter, right? You cannot look at something and say that it's relevant if you don't understand the context of the relevance, right? Or you don't understand the cultural relevance behind why they behave the way they behave, why those policies were put in place from the beginning, why those procedures work the way that they work. So all of these foundational principles work together to inform the mindset. And we keep saying it's the mindset because we understand that international psychology is not really a hard science, right? It's more of a global view. It's the way that you see the world. It's the way that you understand, you know, how people operate and how organizations are set up, right?
I was going to add something to that because I think as international psychologists, one of the things is that we take an ethical code to do no harm.
Yes.
And really our goal and our hope in the work that we're doing is to continue to build bridges because we really believe that we're better when we're together as opposed to when we're fragmented and disconnected from one another. And so if we're not understanding the context, if we're not really rooting and contextualizing our systems and our understanding of the work that we're doing within the context that we're in, then we are going to cause harm, you know, because we're going to be operating outside of those traditions and those practices and the things that bring so much rich meaning to any particular environment that we're stepping into. There's a great deal of responsibility and integrity that goes into you know, doing this kind of work and building bridges in our communities and with one another.
That's great. You're talking about the ethics of the greater good, doing things and being with people for the greater good and impacting communities, not just for yourself, but for the whole.
And I would even talk about the fact that every single individual has an intrinsic value, right? Everyone has an intrinsic value. Every culture has an intrinsic value. And we have to acknowledge that, right? We have to acknowledge that I don't care where you come from. I don't care how you got to the place that you are. There is an intrinsic value that's not attached to you. It is within you, right? And so we acknowledge that as international psychologists, and we respect that. I was brought up to respect, you know, not just who I am, but others. And when you can respect and acknowledge that intrinsic value that comes from whatever culture or whatever ethnicity or whatever creed, you know, whatever background they come from, when we can do that, then we can then come together collaboratively and work for, like you said, Joyce, for a better world for us all, because I believe that we are not, as a people, we are not put upon this earth to do everything ourselves. We are here to work with one another. Where I'm weak at, you know, Deanza, Joyce, you're strong, right? And so I should be able to lean on you to help me through these hard times or these difficult pieces, and I can do the same for you. And we're always better for our diversity. We're always better for our diversity. And so when we talk about, again, when we talk about that sensitivity, when we talk about being contextually informed, when we talk about cultural relevance, we have to acknowledge that we all have an intrinsic value and it means something. We are worth something. And so those values and those traditions, those understandings have to be acknowledged. They have to be embraced. so that we can, like you said, and I love that. I love that so that we can work together for a better world.
Hmm. And that feels good. It
Yes,
feels good to be a part of something where you are intrinsically valued and seen, and what you're bringing to the table is welcome and is included. And it feels good to be able to mutually receive that from other people, and to also intrinsically value what other people bring. There's a symbiotic nature to that, and building that kind of relationship. And I think that's why we do the work that we are doing. I think that's how we work as Linc, is we're always trying to understand better the things that we're bringing to the table because we value each other.
yes.
And that's what speaks, is people feeling valued and feeling seen and feeling heard.
We talked about looking at us as a mosaic because I look at the differences that make up the whole. And when you look at a mosaic, it's a lot of different visuals, but when you put them all together, right, and you step back, you may not see it when you're standing really close to it, but when you step back and you look at the whole, it's beautiful. It creates a pattern that is recognizable, and it's a pattern that you can be proud of, right? It's beautiful. And so when I look at international psychology, I like to say that we exemplify that mosaic. And that's what we want to talk to people about. We want to show them, hey, look, if you have just a flat color, where's the richness? Where's the definition? Where's the texture? There is none because it's flat, right? And it's just one uniform color. And we know, I'm a biologist by nature, by training, undergrad. We know that when you are just homogenous, there is nothing, and there's no ideas that don't fit the mold. Right, you don't get those out of the box thinkings. You don't get those things that because we have to have people who don't think like us in order to progress. And so when we have this mosaic, when we exemplify as a world this mosaic, and we come together and create this beautiful picture, we're working together, we're coming up with different ideas, and we always talk about brainstorming. Well, that comes from people who have different experiences, people who have different backgrounds and traditions and cultures and understandings, and we need that as a world, not just as United States, but as a global village that we are. We need those different ideas and those competing ideas. And I know, Deanza, you talked to us before about the competing, what was it, the competing values framework.
Hmm.
And we have to understand what that means, and I'll let you talk about that in a minute. But we have to have those things so that we can continue to progress. Deanza?
Well, the competing values framework. When do we talk about this? You're gonna have to give me a little more than that. Well, I think that the competing values framework is kind of the opposite of what we're talking about, right?
Yes.
If we're
Yes.
competing for resources, if we're competing for ideas to be on the table, as opposed to seeing that, what's inspiring is when we're all sharing ideas because we learn from one another, and that's what makes the work so deep. That's what makes the work so enticing and exciting, is when we get to learn from one another and hear other people's ideas and figure out how we bring those pieces together to create something together as a group. And so that's what we do at Linc all of the time, right? Like, there's lots of times that we come into meetings and we all have different ideas or different perspectives about how we want to approach the website, or how we want to approach this social media post, or how we want to approach, this teaching module that we're like creating together. And the beauty of it is that we're all very different people, and we have different cultural backgrounds, as well as we live in different parts of the United States. We've had different kind of career paths that have informed us. And all of those things create who we are as individuals, and we bring those things to the table, and we make a lot of space so that we can hear each other and create something together. And I think that's the beauty of what international psychology provides, and these specific principles that we're talking about today. And that's the way that you can move forward together, as opposed to feeling in competition to one another.
Okay, so I have a question for you all. What does it take to have a contextually informed mindset? Where could a person start in this framework that we're talking about?
Wow. Okay. So here's my 2 cents. Where would you start? I think that we start by being willing to alter our perspectives. I think that we have to be willing to see something other than what we know. And we have to be willing to acknowledge that there are other viewpoints that are valid, even if they don't necessarily speak solely to what I know and understand. Just because it's not something that I know and understand does not mean that it's not valid. And if we're willing to acknowledge that and willing to respect that, then we can move forward, go that step forward, and inform ourselves about the context of where we are and what we're dealing with, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about, Karen, is cultural humility, which we talk about all the time. And that is vastly different from how Western psychology has been constructed, where we're the experts of experience, we're the experts of other people's stories. International psychology is really about decolonizing psychology so that we make more space for those different experiences and those different stories that come to the table. And what that really takes is a humility to sit back, to listen, to be an observer, to be a life learner, and to not always have to be the expert on every subject matter, and continue to just kind of grow our knowledge base by listening and hearing from others.
Yeah, so what you're talking about really is, when you say cultural humility, is an openness not just to hearing about another person's perspectives, even if it's different than yours, but cultural humility requires self-reflection. And some people have a hard time with self-reflection. It requires us to really look deep inside ourselves, to really parcel out what is it that we feel and believe, what are those biases that we hold against people who are different than us. And so I think it requires us to be willing to look at that and to face those potentially racist or discriminatory beliefs that could impact the relationship that we have with other people.
Also, it involves fear. You know, it involves the fact that if I open myself to hear you and to listen to you and to understand you, then some kind of way that might undermine my power, my power base. And until I get the understanding that I have no power if I'm closed-minded, because in the long run, I'm going to implode, right? We have to have, I go back to the fact that we have to acknowledge that our strength is our diversity. It really is. Our strength is absolutely our diversity, because we've seen cultures that had a one mindset, and it destroyed the culture, it destroyed the country. Not to get way off topic, but we saw that happen in Nazi Germany. There was a one mindset, right, and it destroyed the country, and it hurt millions of people not just in Germany, but around the world. It created a world war that was very inclusive, based on one culture's having a closed mind and operating in a one world mindset, right? Viewpoint. And so we have to, like you said, we have to have space for those, everybody to be able to speak their truths and to talk about their experiences and be valued for who they are and where they come from. And again, Joyce, you talked about, I won't know your strengths and weaknesses unless I talk to you and I know you and I get to understand where you are and where you're coming from. But it means that you have to get away from that fear, because just because you acknowledge someone else, it costs you nothing to acknowledge someone else. It costs you nothing to have your mind open to other perspectives, right? It doesn't mean that you have to change your perspective, but at least you are open to seeing other perspectives. You may not agree, but when you're willing to open your mind to other perspectives, there's always hope in that, that will cause someone to change their behaviors. And we can change. I say all the time, I was in the Army. We say all the time, we can alter your behavior. We cannot change your character. What we're doing in Linc, and what one of our goals is in talking about international psychology and those foundational principles, is that we're going to change the world one perspective at a time.
Real, yeah, that's it. And it really takes us into the conversation about bias and implicit bias, which I know we won't be able to get into all of that today, but really it's about that. It's what we're seeing right now going on across the United States right now. It's what we're seeing going on, and people feeling threatened and afraid of losing something, and what that does and how that breaks down communities and connection and relationships. And so, that's what we're talking about, is like, we want to offer something different and a different way of being and being in relationship with one another by including and by hearing and listening to one another's different experiences.
Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time right now, and I just want to thank you, ladies, for joining me on Linc Voices. It's always a pleasure to hear your perspectives and talk to you about what we're doing as international psychologists. If any of you are interested in what international psychology is about, please contact one of us, get on and like us, share us, Linc Voices. Leave your comments, questions. I promise you they will be answered, because we're monitoring this as we go along. Stay tuned, because we're going to continue these Linc Voices conversations, and we will eventually be streaming these live, so you can talk right back to us immediately. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us on Linc Voices. We'll see you next time.
Bye.